a couple of other areas that you had some chance to encounter. One was the work around climate change, and this is something we didn't have space for in your
Yeah.
article for us. You've been active around Green New Deal organizing here in New York in attempts to win legislation to um, sort of move New York forward in addressing climate change. Uh, what did you encounter in Cuba, and why was that so thought-provoking?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say in here in New York, I am part of the Eco Socialist Working Group, part of NYC DSA. And, our big uh, accomplishment of the last few years was winning this piece of legislation called the Build Public Renewables Act, which basically authorizes the New York Power Authority, NYPA, which is set up under FDR, to build public renewable projects. That one bill took 5 years and it took hundreds of people and I don't know, hundreds of thousands of like hours to to get it through. In Cuba, they have their climate plan is called Tarea Vida. It translates roughly to like life task or life work. It's 100-year climate plan. It spans all the way to the year 2100, and it's this plan to um, look at the data as it's coming in about how things are going to change in Cuba, and then you know basically have a short term, a medium term, and like a long term and a very long term phased plan on how to deal with what's happening in Cuba um, as the climate changes. Like most of the global South, Cuba emits a paltry amount of carbon every year, but they are going to probably bear the brunt of the climate changing, especially sea level rise. And one of the things that they were saying to us was that Cuba's uh, the climate there is already kind of gone from a tropical to a subtropical climate over the past 10 years, and that means changing weather patterns, changing rain patterns, changing soil conditions. And so they're doing things like, number one, the most sort of aggressive part of the plan is they are banning new construction in sort of high risk areas. And they
That would never
are,
happen in New York.
no, I mean, can you imagine that happening anywhere in the United States? I don't think so. I mean, again, there's a frame of this of oh my God, a strong, what a like big brother kind of government that's going in and telling people they can't live in a certain place. So it's like, no, it's a government acting rationally, in my opinion, in the interest of its population, right? And saying, look, your house is going to be underwater in 10 years, in 20 years. Like we shouldn't continue to build here. And not only that, they are trying to get people to move out of places that are, that they have like deemed as high risk areas. Um, According to them, it's all voluntary. And there's actually there's a documentary about that I watched where there's a couple people who are holding out because it's their home, is all they know. Um, they're doing things like restoring mangroves and really trying to bring like natural uh, there's a term for this that it's not coming to me, but it's like using things like mangroves to sort of like break waves and help reduce the amount of like
Mhm.
hurricane impact on the island, as an example. That's part of this short term part of the plan. So yeah, and of course, because of the way Cuba's economy is structured, I talked about the Build Public Renewables Act. Like everything Cuba builds is public. So they're building public renewables as like just by by existing by like anything they build. At any time the government there's a solar panel that goes up in Cuba, it's a public renewable. So it's, again, it was just like an interesting flip where here we have to kind of account for the market solutions, but in Cuba, like there's not really a market. So they don't have to deal with shareholders and pleasing like oil oligarchs or whatever. Like they try to, you know the people who I talked to who worked at these institutions, like their sense was like, we look at the data, we bring the data to the powers that be, we discuss what should happen, and we go from there. So that was, again, like kind of refreshing and a little mind-blowing to just, I'm sure there's friction in other places, but the frictions are very different than what we encounter here when we try to like basically do anything, which is like going up against an entrenched like oligarch class that like wants to keep their money flowing. It's a
Right.
different set of concerns there. Yeah.
And then one other area you got to encounter, you visited, um uh you visited the, I think it was the Center on Gender and Sexuality,
The Center
which
for
is,
Sex Education. Yeah, the Center for Sex
yeah,
Education. Yeah, that
which
was the
is
first
overseen
thing
by
we did. The
yeah.
first morning we went to uh, the Center for Sex Education, which is a national, again, government-run institution that came out of the revolution. Um, uh, the revolution had a very big focus on feminism, basically, and like really elevating the plight of women in Cuba at the time. Um, Vilma Espin, who was the wife of Raul Castro, who was part of the revolutionary movement, called the plight of women the revolution inside the revolution. And so they took great measures really to try and um, uh, bring women to a place of equality inside of Cuban society, which, like a lot of Latin American cultures, and it's still there. It's not that they stamped it out completely, of course. And they don't claim that they have either. But the Center for Sex Education is run by Mariela Castro, who is Raul Castro's daughter. Raul Castro is Fidel Castro's brother. So Fidel Castro's niece, Mariela Castro, runs this institution, and it's a really good example of, this is an institution that is run by the government of Cuba, that basically, the things in the US that would be sort of the terrain of nonprofits and advocacy groups like LGBTQ rights, transgender rights, things of that nature. It goes the other way here. Here, the government are the people who are trying to convince the public that about gay marriage, for example, which was legalized in Cuba very recently as part of their family code, which is part of their constitution, that they voted on via referendum. They had this big reform of their constitution in 2019, and then an additional, more recent reform, I think it was in 2021, of what they call their family code. And one of the things that this new reform brought to the table was legalizing same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, things of that nature. And Mariela Castro kind of described what the campaign for this was like, and it was contentious. It was a hard fight. It ultimately ended up being a referendum, and it was voted. It was approved 60% yes to 30% no, which, again, just in the U.S., that's a mandate. That's a landslide. In Cuba, it's like the most contentious vote they've ever had on any referendum. And so it goes to show how much work they have left to do. But I would say, to go from a place where, soon after the revolution, they didn't treat gay people with a whole lot of like dignity. And in fact, like, you can find quotes of like Che and other people saying that like homosexuality is against revolutionary ideals. But then to come around to a place where 70% basically of your population votes to approve this family code that legalizes same-sex marriage. This was a government campaign. Again, that's the thing that is like the reverse it's like this weird inverse of what we're used to here, right? Where we have to campaign the government to do things. In Cuba, it's like the government takes up these causes and then puts them to a referendum and launches and does a political campaign on part of the government, you know. So it's a really interesting like dynamic. And I would, yeah, and we can get into it more later, but like this bottom up and versus top down and how they do things in Cuba is very, very different and very interesting.
Right. And um, I, I know we said we go to questions later. We do have a comment from Dave Whitman saying, or is the government leading the people, or is it catching up with people? On, I guess on something like this. I mean,
Yeah, it's, you know, I think the fact that it was their most contentious uh, referendum vote to date says something about how much is catching up and how much is the government pushing an agenda. You know, like it is an agenda. The government has an agenda. Nobody's trying to hide it, and no government official that we talked to tried to hide it either. There's no secret about it. They launched a political campaign, and just like a nonprofit would do here, they had posters, they had literacy, literature. I mean, they you know they had parades, they had all sorts of stuff to try and basically make the case to the public um, about what uh, about what they wanted to do with this family code. They wanted Cuba to have the most progressive family code in Latin America. That was their goal, and it seems like they did. I guess to Bruce's question,
yeah,
Mariela Castro talked about the Catholic Church as one, of course, the main sources of opposition to the family code. Um, she implied, again, this is Mariela Castro speaking, that a lot of like American money is routed through the Catholic Church that goes to fund sort of oppositional stances in Cuba. So that was her implication. Caveat, asterisk, all that stuff. But yeah, that's the they are still influential there, 100%. I mean, 30% voted no. Like that's in Cuba, that's a big deal. So you know, it's something that's still evolving. And the thing I want to stress is like everyone we talk to in Cuba, including the president, they're one of the first things they would say is Cuba's not perfect. Cuba is changing. Cuba is adapting. We have to adapt. We have to be resilient. We have to, I mean, the number of times we heard that from high-ranking government officials was kind of astounding, really. Whereas like here, I feel like the first thing every US politician has to say is like America's perfect. And like
we are an
we have no
exceptional
flaws.
nation.
Yeah, we're exceptional. That's not how they see that. I mean, not what they
They have
told
their own
us
way
anyway.
of being exceptional, but they,
Yeah, sure, but they understand that like it's a process. It's not something they've arrived at, you know, and like now have to like never change ever again.
yeah.
um yeah.
So, I want to talk more about your encounters with government officials, but first of
Yeah.
all, I mean, you sort of laid out what you saw as some of the positive or at least hopeful uh, features of Cuban society. Um, it, and then there's also the U.S. embargo. You want to talk a little bit about how that functions
Yeah.
and why that's damaging, but also how it's gotten to the point where many people in Cuba feel that the government is using that simply as an excuse to rationalize its own failings, and in some cases,
Hmm.
I think it's all a conspiracy theory. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the embargo, I write in the piece that it is kind of like at once it's a creator and a destroyer of Cuba, because the sort of like the brand of socialism in Cuba that you see is a direct consequence of the embargo. But also like the embargo has extremely destructive it has been extremely destructive since it was first put in place a few months after the revolution happened, and then got more and more codified as the years went on. But what we call the embargo is really, it's kind of a set of executive orders and laws that limit Cuba's access to all sorts of stuff. Mainly, and most recently, is it impacts Cuba's ability to function on the international market in various ways. For example, one thing that Trump did basically on his way out the door was he added Cuba back to the state sponsors of terror list, which is this list that the U.S. State Department has. I think it's 4 countries. It's like Cuba, Syria, Iraq. It's like
Iran and North Korea, probably.
Iran and North Korea. Yeah, those are the state sponsors of terror. I think all of them are slightly questionable, but I think Cuba especially.
And it's just a lot of chutzpah for the United States to
exactly.
Exactly.
So what this does is, though, it creates basically no country, like there are few entities that would want to engage in trade with Cuba and risk being sanctioned by, the most powerful like economic and military entity on the planet. And it makes it so that basically Cuba, they don't really have like credit in the same way that like the United States or like any other government in the world runs on credit. I mean, that's how governments function. Most of the things Cuba buys and imports, it has to pay basically cash on hand.
Yep. So what did this look like?
I mean, one very interesting example that I saw is our hotel was right on the bay. It was right on the water, and so when you looked out, you could see these cargo ships that were out there, and they were near Cuba, but they weren't coming into the harbor. They weren't really coming in. And when I asked about it, they explained to me that like basically ships arrive, and then they just kind of have to wait for this legal sort of maze of payments to happen before they're able to bring the cargo into the island. It's like it has to be routed by a third party before that the payments actually come through, because people don't want to like risk being sanctioned. That's the number one thing. It has the sanctions have a very like chilling effect on people doing trade.
Lose access to the U.S. market, among other things.
That's right. And then if a ship docks in Cuba, it is not allowed to dock in the United States for 180 days. Okay. Again, this is a country that's 90 miles away. So you tell me what shipping company is going to want to bring a ship to Cuba and lose access to shipping in the United States for 180 days. It's it seems like a minor thing, but it actually ends up adding up to a huge impact on Cuba, and it leads to things like they will meet ships in international waters. They will send their ships out to international waters and meet these other trade ships outside of Cuban waters, so that the exchanges can happen out in international water. And we're talking like fuel exchanges here, like from one ship to another, which is like extremely dangerous. And like not to mention like it's an environmental like disaster waiting to happen. But it's what they're forced to do, because they have to, again, this idea of like Cuban resiliency, Cubans making do, Cubans having to dig within themselves and like really find ways around these impositions that are there and have been there for 65 years. That's the other thing. It's like this is not new. Like Trump definitely reinvigorated it. Biden has done not next to nothing, nothing really to alleviate it. But this is standard U.S. policy going back 65 years, and it's, there are laws on the books that make this happen. There's a Cuban Adjustment Act. There are actual like congressional laws that have been passed in Congress in the 90s that like sort of codified and like legalized, in a congressional sense, what the embargo is and what its effects are. And so, yeah, there are serious limitations, material limitations in Cuba, and it's getting worse all the time. And then, what happened, especially more recently, is Trump reimposed, I think it was like 243 of the sanctions that were relaxed under Obama. Then he added them to the state sponsors of terror list. And then they got hit by COVID. And so that 1-2 sort of punch of a reinvigorated blockade, and then sort of like, the economic pandemonium that every country experienced under COVID, the hit to their tourism, the hit to their manufacturing, the hit to all that stuff. It's been devastating for the island. And I think the latest numbers are like 500,000 Cubans have left Cuba in the last few years, which is around like 4% of the population in total has left Cuba. So there's sort of like a brand new wave of Cuban immigrants who have left the country, just like trying to find a place with, where the economic prospects are not quite as dire. And one of the things that this taxi driver was explaining to me was that, like, yeah, it's real easy to feel hopeless right now in Cuba. You just don't really see a way through, or a way out of this mess that they find themselves in, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. Like, they had to reach out to the UN food program just this week, so that the UN could help them get milk, powdered milk, into the country so that they can feed it to their babies. It's like, it's pretty dire, and I think it's often a story. It goes under the radar, I feel like, especially with all the warranted attention on Gaza right now. A lot of the same imperial mechanisms of control are in place in Gaza, and have now been like ramped up to the extreme in Gaza, are there in Cuba too. There's a blockade in Gaza. There's a blockade in Cuba. There's a tight control over what can go in and what can go out that also exists in Cuba. There are hungry people in Gaza. There are hungry people in Cuba, or people with just barely enough to eat. So this is not to say that like the government of Cuba has never done anything wrong and doesn't have incompetent people in it and doesn't have bureaucracy that's maybe a little bit unnecessary. Those are problems of every government. What I always say is the Cuban government has just as much of a right to be incompetent as anywhere else on the planet. It's not unique to Cuba. What is unique to Cuba is this blockade put in place by the hegemonic and dominant economic and military power in the world. And that is, that's the thing that they are constantly having to weigh every decision that they make against. And, there's just no easy answers for them, I feel. Are you still there, John? Did you leave?
All right. Sorry. So,
No, you're good.
Sorry, got muted there for a moment myself.
Oh.
So we had a couple of questions from Bruce, asking one, why the U.S. relaxed the embargo in the final years of Obama's presidency,
Mm-hmm.
and also to what extent Cuba trades with China and whether China can be, an alternate source
Yeah.
of much of what the country needs. Because, I think if there's any country the U.S. would have a hard time pushing around, it would be China because of the size of its economy.
Yeah. Um, as to why Obama decided to thaw relations with Cuba, that's a good question. There are probably good like political answers to that question. But I think anyone can tell that the embargo is an outdated and kind of like very brutal approach to foreign policy. And Obama, to his credit, because an additional complication is that like what Obama did was really change his administration's interpretation of laws around the embargo, because the president cannot unilaterally lift the embargo because these are laws. It's sort of like enshrined in laws that are passed by Congress. And so what his administration did, and even this had such a huge impact, is just basically kind of reinterpret what the letter of the law says. And we think this would allow this, and we think this would allow that. And what changed immediately is American cruise ships started going to Cuba. And that was, I mean, that changed everything. And trade started flowing a little bit more freely. It wasn't that it was lifted. I think the word thaw is a good uh, sort of like way of describing it. It wasn't an unfreezing, it was a thaw, and it could have gone further, but we got Trump, and Trump basically froze it again. And so, actually, one experience that I didn't write about at all was we went to this market that was built in an old warehouse next to sort of like the port where a lot of the cruise ships were supposed to be coming in. And some cruise ships from other places still go there. But what the Cuban government did was they saw this was a huge economic opportunity for Cuba. And so they converted this warehouse, this enormous warehouse, into kind of like an artisan's market, where they had all these different stalls of Cubans who would go and they would sell, things that they would make, or just like souvenirs. It was admittedly like a tourist trap that they had built out of this old warehouse. But again, thinking that, oh, we're gonna invest $100 million into this market now, but the economic payouts are going to be great because we're going to have these American tourists coming to Cuba, and then like the rug got pulled out under them, and they're left with this. It wasn't empty, but when we went, it wasn't like a bustling market that you just saw the potential for it, because it was literally right next door to where all the cruise ships were to come in. And you just, it was kind of like an exit through the gift shop situation, but for Cuba. And so, it's things like that wow, they were banking on these changes. And it really got, the rug really got pulled out from under them, and it really like kind of sad. It's sad, what happened there. There was all of the, and when you talk to Cubans, they'll tell you about the thaw, and like this feeling of like, oh, things are finally going to change, and like we're going to have a different relationship. And I should say, like, a lot of Cubans have really no animosity toward the United States or toward Americans. Like, they understand this is like a matter of like governments relating to each other, and a lot of them have like connections to the US. They have family who lives here. They have you know acquaintances who have moved over the years, and so they were looking forward to also seeing their families again and seeing their friends again, and all of these different things that were seeming like they were possible. And then at the flick of a pen, basically, it all sort of like evaporated. And unfortunately, I have to say, Biden has done nothing on this. The situation is exactly as it was the day Trump left office. All of the sanctions Trump reimposed are pretty much still there. Um, and so there's been very little movement on the Cuba issue. maybe he'll wait till his second term like Obama did. I don't know. I guess they're afraid of losing the Miami vote, which will never happen. That ship sailed a long time ago. And in fact, many younger Cubans like me would welcome a change in relations. I feel, but there's this weird, like, I don't know, aversion to acting too aggressively toward changing relations with Cuba and like making the Miami Cubans mad. But to me, in my mind, that's why would you? They're never going to vote
Yeah, that
Democrat
seems
ever
like
again.
another sort of, case maybe of Biden sort of being kind of lost in the past.
100%, 100%.
So we have a question from Marcia Newfield. She's asking, given everything you're saying, what can ordinary citizens do to remove the embargo?
That's a really good question. There is a really big Cuba solidarity movement in the United States that has been around for a long time. As part of DSA, we are sort of like a fledgling member of this Cuba solidarity movement. Like I said, we have an international committee, and we have like a subgroup that's working on Cuba stuff. That this delegation was part of. I think obviously pressure from the outside, I think, is really our only lever right now, because on the inside it just seems to be going nowhere. And even on the outside, it's tough right now to get people to think about anything else that's not Gaza, which is completely understandable. But it's a tough situation, and I think like it's going to take a bit of a like revitalized Cuba solidarity movement in the United States in order for like big changes to actually happen, because we have to pass laws to undo this. Like this is not going to be an easy thing to like push across. So yeah.
Sorry about that, folks.
Yeah.
Something that in the past has been something a lever, is the interest in sort of the farm states and being able to export to Cuba.
Yes.
You would see
Yes.
sort of farm state Republican Congress people, visiting Havana and extolling the virtues of more open trade with Cuba.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
it
there
might need
you will
a
find
cross-class
unlikely
alliance.
allies when it comes to when it comes to stuff like that, because yeah, there are farmers who want to export stuff to Cuba, who want to export farm equipment to Cuba. I think a big area of that Cuba itself is betting on is their biotech sector, which is a thing we haven't touched on yet, but it's like, I did not associate biotechnology like with Cuba, but they have a huge biotech sector. And we went to their sort of center for biotechnology and met with the scientists there, and it was incredible. One, I mean, they developed their own COVID vaccine, which is, I don't have to say anything else, is pretty like amazing. But again, the like the complicating factor is they did it out of necessity because they could not keep the Pfizer vaccines at a reliable temperature on the island, because they had big fluctuations in energy on the island, and the power would go out and the freezers would go out, and they couldn't keep them like at the right temperature. And so, they put public health first, and they spent a bunch of resources to invest in their 5 vaccine candidates, which ended up being, the Abdala vaccine, which vaccinated 98% of their population against Cuba. And they were able to, because it was not an mRNA vaccine, it was like a traditional, injected deactivated virus into you vaccine. They were able to vaccinate kids earlier, actually, than most other places, because it wasn't this newer type of technology.
Yeah.
But also, like, they the presentation that we got from one of the scientists there was about this medication that basically completely closes diabetic ulcers, like I mean, we've got a very graphic presentation about this with like lots of images about how well it's working. But again, they developed this technology. It's widely used in Cuba, but they can't move it. They can't sell it to markets outside of Cuba. And in fact, one of the things this scientist said to us was like, we need venture capital money in Cuba. Like venture capitalists are not evil. He said that to us, and us as like American leftists were like, "Oh, what do you mean?" But like they don't have that. They don't have the luxury of weight of like of it's like real politique. Like they need investment capital. They just need it, and they're like begging for it basically. And so it's a very interesting like dynamics. Like, please, we need venture capital here in Cuba, but no American company can profit from Cuban pharmaceuticals, and so the investment doesn't come, or the investments start to get worked out and they fall through because of sanctions, because of all the impositions. So, yeah.
Right. So we've had a couple more questions here
Yeah.
in relation to sort of how to organize here in the U.S. against the Cuba blockade. Marshall, I think, was again maybe asking for a little bit more information about the solidarity movement. And then we have Brad Lorton from Central Indiana DSA
Awesome.
asking if you have any advice for
Yeah.
folks out in his corner of the woods, how to organize a local campaign against the blockade. I mean, I guess that part of the question here is how do you take uh, local initiatives in a way that can add up to sort of more, larger than the sum of the parts and get
Yes.
sort of national motion going here.
Yeah, that's at the end of the day, this is like a federal matter, right? So, but there are things we can do. For example, in New York, we organized here so to pass or to like a bunch of our legislators got together and sent a letter to President Biden, like demanding an end to the embargo. You can pass local resolutions in your city councils, in your local legislatures against the embargo. All of those actions, they seem small, but they do add up over time, and they add weight to the overall like argument that like this is an outdated policy. More and more people disagree with it. We've seen what external pressure can do. We've seen how the Biden administration is slowly lurching away from just outright support of what's happening in Gaza all the time, and that's in part due to coordinated, organized outside pressure. And so, we should take advantage of the fact that they're still responsive to that kind of thing. And yeah, like even things that might seem small, and it's not really necessarily a small deal to pass like a resolution in your local legislature against the embargo. But in Central Indiana, you should talk to farmers. Like a lot of farmers are against the embargo because it prevents them from exporting stuff to Cuba. So
You're saying there's a lot of hungry stomachs in Cuba, and then
that's right.
you've got
Exactly.
farmers with extra
Exactly.
crops.
Exactly.
So
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So, there's a lot of avenues that we could I would argue, this is my hot take here, but like I think the Cuba solidarity movement needs to get a little more creative. We need to figure out different avenues of expressing solidarity with Cuba. I think the delegation that we did is a good start. I think organizing as DSA, like we have people that we've elected who now we can organize as well. And so that's an avenue that I personally am pursuing with our electeds here in New York State of saying, let's actually put some pressure behind the federal government here by sending letters and opening a dialogue between our elected officials and people at the Cuban mission here to the UN that's based here in New York. So that's an example of what what DSA specifically, which is sort of my path to involvement here, is doing. But people, I'm sure, will post links to all sorts of Cuba normalization.org is great. There's an organization called ACERE, ACERE, that does great work about around Cuba and has a great name. It kind of means bro in like Cuban slang, but it's an acronym for something. I love it. Yes, thank you. Seria.org. Yeah, there are lots of groups doing stuff. I think we need more concertedness and coordination, but there's work happening. And so I think, if this is an issue that um, speaks to you, definitely get involved, and get involved in the DSA work too. If you're in New York State, we are organizing a push around this in New York DSA especially, and other people can post about other stuff going on.
Right. I mean, there's 8 socialist state legislators here in New
Yeah,
York,
yeah,
probably more than any other state in the country right now.
yeah.
Uh, uh, I do want to pivot a little bit to your encounters with the Cuban government at the highest
Mhm.
level. But I want we have some questions from Peter that came in earlier. Peter Gallet, thank you for your patience. He asked one question that was similar to what Bruce had asked about. Could Cuba acquire medical supplies and farming equipment from China? And then another point he made is nickel is one of the most in-demand elements for electronic vehicles and is in tight world supply. Nickel has been prominent in Cuban mining in the past, and I believe Cuba has large reserves of nickel. Uh, so why is it that Cuba has not figured out how to become a major world supplier of nickel? It uh, is a nickel worth a dollar or more? Can nickel bring in more dollars? Uh,
I'm sure it can. I won't pretend to be an expert in this field. However, I will say that, like,
all right, don't nickel and dime us.
I won't nickel and dime you about this issue, but I will say that, to sort of use like a crude expression, like it takes money to make money, in that it takes money to build the for okay.
Could they get foreign partner? I guess, or is there a way they could get international partners? 'Cause, I mean, obviously
What
mining's
I
a
always respond to this question is I'm pretty sure they've tried. I don't think they're just sitting back and letting their country fall apart. I'm sure there are valid reasons as to why these. Number one, I mean, this is something that was told to us a bunch of times. It's expensive as hell to import from all the way from China or from India, which is a thing they have to do. It makes importing basic stuff like that much more expensive, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, 10 times more expensive. They don't have credit, so whatever they're paying for, they have to have the cash on hand in order to pay for, or like route things through third party. So it's like it's just not as simple as like, well, just like trade with China. Like when the global hegemonic power determines that they will not trade with you and they will sanction other entities that will, that has a huge ripple effect that just like I don't think people quite get like the international scope of the, because this is the thing I hear all the time, like in Miami. It's like, well, there are hundreds of other countries in the world. Why can't they trade with those places? Why can't they? And it's like, it's just not that simple. Every financial transaction in the world has to go through the United States. It's called the SWIFT system.
yeah.
Um,
That was part of the sanctions they launched against Russia at the beginning of
exactly,
the where they cut,
exactly,
cut them
exactly.
off. Now Russia was big enough to sort of overcome that.
Right. But Cuba is not. That's the problem. They are not a huge country with a huge GDP. They are a tiny island in the Caribbean. Again, the tragic part is they are 90 miles away, right? Like it's right there. Like people get from Miami to Cuba in very creative ways because it's really not that much of a distance. And so, yeah, when you have to bring things from halfway around the world as opposed to at your doorstep, yes, it costs a lot more money, and it's not as simple as trade with another country. It
Yeah,
has
right.
international implications when the dollar, the country that prints the dollar, you know, doesn't want to do trade with you.
Right. I'll just quickly note here, Cuba was plugged into Comecon, the communist trading bloc led by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Had a whole set of economic relationships with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries for all sorts of equipment, and they traded their oranges and their sugar for Soviet
Mm-hmm.
tractor parts, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that all fell apart. And then the sanctions were greatly intensified in the mid '90s, the
Mm-hmm.
Helms-Burton law. So, I mean, that's part of the backstory here.
100%.
Is that they did have sort of an economic bubble they were plugged into that popped at the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Soviet Union. And in some ways, maybe the last 30 years been about them trying to sort of try to find a solid footing again. Um, uh,
And I want to highlight Bob's answer there. Bob has also helped us organize our trip to Cuba about nickel. He's the one who knows a great deal about this sort of thing. So, Bob, go ahead. Feel free to chime in with any answers that I might not have a full comprehension of here. That thank
Maybe
you.
your international committee needs a nickel caucus or
Yeah, we
something.
need. Yes, we need a nickel caucus.
So the Cuban government. So
Mm-hmm.
uh, obviously they were eager to whatever to see
Yes.
you guys cultivate your support and
Yes.
enthusiasm. Um, so you had a chance to visit the Cuban Parliament and to visit I guess, the Palacio de la Revolucion,
Mm-hmm.
where Fidel used to, hold forth, and now his successor, President Miguel Diaz-Canel, was there, and y'all got to meet with him. Now, as you kind of conveyed in your article, I mean, there was like these statements of fraternal greetings and comradely warmth, and all of that. But I mean, I thought the most interesting part of some of what you've written about this, I don't think we had time to get to it in the Indy article, was kind of how defensive the president and also the speaker of the parliament were about those 2021 protests in Cuba, that erupted, as the country, descended into economic crisis. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, and, I guess if you can talk about that, both, kind of what happened 3 years ago, kind of why the defensiveness, and obviously kind of an awkward situation maybe for you and other delegation members who participated in so many protests yourselves, and probably many of you have been arrested or uh,
Yep.
or worse by the cops.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we've had some comments from Dave Lippman and Mindy Gershon. I think Dave said, all governments are repressive, including so far to date, socialist governments.
Yep.
So, this moment where this maybe well-meaning government,
Sure.
has a repressive side to it,
Sure.
and that there you are in the revolutionary palace with the president who's trying to, sort of
Yeah.
explain this.
Yeah. Um, there was it did make me kind of squirm in my seat a little bit to hear the president, and also when we were at the Capitol, one of like a high ranking member of the sort of like assembly of people's power, was what they call it there, talk about these protests in 2021 using a lot of the same language that I've heard many times used by
Outside
powerful people in the United States to try to like dismiss um, dismiss a protest movement, or try to like justify some of the repression that happened. And it's important to name that that's what happened in Cuba, right? This was not, I think I think their defensiveness about it, we're a bunch of Americans showing up to Cuba asking them about their like democracy and their, I don't know. I sort of felt like it was a little inappropriate of us to sort of to really raise that with them. It wasn't, in my opinion, and people did ask direct questions to like Cuban officials about those protests. I didn't feel like it was the right, not the purpose of what like a diplomatic exchange is for. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, yes, in 2021, Cuba had really unprecedented protests in the streets. And this was really at the height of the economic crisis that is happening there, when things were, just post COVID. I think there's an element of almost what happened here in the U.S. where we were all cooped up, and then there was this explosion of energy. I think it was a very similar social dynamic there of what happened in Cuba, but it was in reaction to something very real, which is that people's daily lives in Cuba is becoming more and more difficult. Getting food is more and more difficult. Finding the basic toilet paper, right? The basics is hard. Okay. And yeah, there is discontent on the island right now. That is 100% true. You hear it when you talk to Cubans, especially young Cubans. I found that the political dynamic in Cuba is kind of like the inverse of what we find here, where it's like here, it tends to be, oh, the older you are, the more conservative you are. Of course, it's not true across the board, but and then the younger you are, the more like progressive or left leaning you are. In Cuba, it's kind of the opposite, where older folks who were alive before the revolution or sort of came of age with the revolution are much more likely to be in favor of the revolution, to speak highly of it, whereas younger people who have grown up pretty much in crisis their entire lives see it differently, and they're more disenchanted, and they make up the majority of the people who have left the island in the past few years to sort of seek other economic opportunities in other places. And it was mostly young people who were out on the streets in 2021 protesting. Now, I have to add this is all about layering, right? Yes, there were protests. There were, according to the president himself, there were 1,000 arrests. I think he said 300 of them were under 18 and were let go immediately. And there's still 500 people basically to this, as of October 2023, when we were there were still 500 people going through the process. And this is several years after these protests happened, right? So, take that with you. Keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about all of this. Is that political repression? I think we can say so. They would say something like, what the line that was used was, they were arrested for their actions and not their ideas. That's the line that we got from the government, right? Which is like, these people were rioting, they were looting, they were breaking into stores, they were doing this, that, and the other. I wasn't there. I don't know. Okay. And then, the additional layer is there has been a concerted, decades-long effort on part of the United States to undermine and overthrow the government of Cuba by sowing dissent. Okay, the embargo is part of that strategy, right? The explicit aim of the embargo, this is said by, the people who created the initial legal actions that resulted in the embargo, is to basically create a situation where the people of Cuba overthrow the government. That is the stated purpose of the United States blockade and embargo against Cuba. There's the Bay of Pigs example, where we quite literally recruited Cuban expats and they invaded the island. There's this very long campaign that Cuba feels defensive about. Yes, they feel defensive. There's no question about that. In my opinion, it's mostly warranted. But what it leads to is this feedback loop that you see over the decades, where there's this justifiable paranoia on part of the Cuban government that they're being infiltrated, or that the US government is up to something, and then they end up closing and being, more censorship, more repression, more kind of lashing out, right, and really trying to maintain control of this ship that they're steering in these extremely hostile waters. And so, you know, they see themselves as a wartime government. That's how they see themselves. They as under siege, and wartime governments are not places where you go to find a thriving democratic civil liberties culture. You know, for many, you know, it's not. It's just that's just those two things are not really compatible with each other. I would say, despite all of that, what I did find, you know, democratic practices in Cuba. Maybe we'll have some time to touch on that later. This idea I saw earlier of like bottom up, the Cuban government is not bottom up, it's top down. I saw things that challenged that notion, but that, you know, they have to govern as if they are under siege. That's just the long and short of it. And when and so their response to, you know, they jailed, my grandfather was jailed for 6 years. Okay. Like,
Right.
but he was also funneling money to counter revolutionaries. So, you know, there's this cycle of like, yeah, how many nascent left-wing revolutions have been smothered out by right-wing, you know, reaction? A lot. And they survived that. So, you know, there's always a push and pull, there's always a contradiction, there's always like layers upon layers to peel back, and there's not a simple narrative. That's the number, like all the threads are hanging in front of your face, and you just have to like tie them all together and have one and make a rope of all the contradictions and all the different things existing at the same time, because that's just the reality of it.
Yeah. So one last question about the sort of the top down part of the
Yeah.
leadership here, maybe. So any other impressions from your meeting with the president of Cuba? I mean, obviously, it's fairly rare access for ordinary American, and and also this sort of comparison he has to live with, sort of with the shadow of the
Yes.
Castro brothers, especially Fidel Castro. Yeah, I mean, and sort of the whole Castro cult of personality, or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he's
100%. I was joking throughout the trip, and I think this is more or less true, that like post Castro, the Cuban government has like a 35% legitimacy penalty that they will pay forever, because Castro, for better or for worse, was the political glue that held the entire like Cuban political project together. And with him gone, I think part of what is happening in Cuba is there is a crisis of legitimacy with the government. And I think that partially also explains the way they responded to these protests and why they feel so defensive about it. And you know, there's the Diaz Canal, he's a bureaucrat. He's clean shaven. He doesn't wear the military fatigues. Like he's he's trying to embody a new era for Cuba, right? And I think unfortunately his like the beginning of his presidency also was when like right before COVID and right when Trump like reinstated all these. So he came to power already with sort of like a difficult task of like confronting this larger than life like political figure that had held the island together for 60 years. And then these additional like kind of near unprecedented challenges that he's facing and trying to lead the country through. Yeah, there's a crisis. I think there is a crisis of like political legitimacy on the island right now. And you see one of the sort of propaganda posters that you see a lot is this poster of Fidel's brother Raul, and then Diaz Canal all together in like a line. And on the bottom it reads, "We are continuity." That is their sort of like, that's their brand. That's their little TM. It's "We are continuity." And they're really trying to instill this idea that like Diaz Canal is the continuation of this political project that was brought, you know, into the world by the Castros. Whether it's working or not, I don't know. I feel like I would need to spend more time there and talk to more Cubans to really get a sense of like whether Cubans feel like it is a continued, but it doesn't help that he has been confronted with sort of this huge economic crisis, and like the bottom is kind of falling out of the economy right now. And yeah, and I think that explains a little bit part of their wrestling a little bit at like a bunch of Americans coming to Cuba and asking them, hey, why did you arrest these people during your protests? It's like, well, who the hell are you to come here and talk to us about that? Like, so again, like, do I condone it 100%? No. Do I condemn it 100%? Also no. Like there's the answer is just more complicated than that. And we can't really like slide back into these black and white understandings of things because you just won't get the full picture that way.
Right. Actually, we've had a couple of people asking about the Cuba's relationship with Venezuela. I mean, it was getting subsidized oil
Yeah.
during the sort of the heyday of Hugo Chavez's presidency.
I think today is the anniversary of Hugo Chavez's death, if I remember, in 2015, if I'm remembering correctly.
Sounds about right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was March of 2013, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, is there anything anything solid you have to offer about?
Yeah, I mean the oil was flowing, and then
Now it's not
then the sanctions came. So like
Venezuela, right?
yeah, the sanctions on Venezuela are also affect Cuba, and it's just yeah, that's really the long and short of it. There are right now, I know because I talk to folks at the Cuban mission who tell me this. Right now, every day the power is on in Cuba for like 6 hours a day because there's just not enough fuel to burn to keep the electricity flowing at all times, and so they have scheduled kind of brownouts throughout the day. It's just not coming in at enough of a pace to keep things, and just imagine if your power were out 6 hours a day, how that would affect everything you do, like keeping your food in the refrigerator,
You might not be able to do this Zoom discussion.
That's right, 100%. Well, not to mention, if we were in Cuba, we would not have access to Zoom because Zoom is an American product, and where they that's the other thing. Basic communication tools, they don't work in Cuba. When you try to open them in Cuba, they tell you this product. I tried it. You're not allowed to use this. It gives you like a little pop-up message that saying that like due to legal blah blah blah, you're not allowed to use this product in Cuba. So like, yeah.
Right. And so yeah, we're coming down to about our last 25 minutes here.
Yeah.
So I think most of the people who are on this call at the beginning are still with us. I thank everybody for I hope you all are
staying power. I like that.
enjoying the conversation or finding it informative. For people who came in late, my name's John Tarleton. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Independent, a free radical newspaper here in New York that's been publishing for 24 years. And Danny wrote the cover story for our February edition. And Danny's written for us a long time ago in the past, so it's great to have you byline back in the paper, Danny. We're going to put some links in the chat again, where you can find out more about the Independent. You can look at our archive of recent and past issues if you want to see what we're kind of about. And also we have a website, independent.org, and some social media platforms that we update fairly frequently. We also have an event coming up on Thursday night. We're going to be screening Born in Gaza, a documentary made after the 2014 Gaza war about how the violence of the war affected 10 Palestinian children. And then we're going to have a great panel discussion afterwards led by my colleague Amber Gagarian. We're going to have a great Middle Eastern journalist, Sharif Abdel Qaddous. You've seen him on Democracy Now! Over the years, and The Guardian, Intercept, and Al Jazeera, many other places, and also two really dynamic young Palestinian women writers, Sarah Aziza and Farah Berkawi. So that'll be out at Star Bar, 214 Star Street, in Bushwick, Brooklyn. We'll also put a link in for the Star Bar website. You can find out more about them and how to get out there if you want to go. So that's going to be an amazing night. But I'm glad we still have a little bit of time with you, Danny. Uh, um, so, maybe talk here a few minutes about
Yeah.
what you consider the sort of bottom up side
Yeah.
of
Sure.
the Cuban system. Definitely, we've had some debate going on
Yes.
in the chat about that. I appreciate everybody's comments, and definitely, if you have more questions or comments, pour them in there, and we'll try to get to them by 9 o'clock. Um, so let's take a few minutes to talk about
Yeah. So
what you talked
what
about the family law thing, but what else would you describe as being examples of a sort of a bottom up grassroots democracy in Cuba?
Yeah. So look, there's no denying that Cuba has a strong central state. That's the government. That's how it's run. There's no denying that there is one political party in Cuba, the Cuban Communist Party, that is sort of the amalgamation of a lot of different political parties come together over the years. Third, there's no denying that there's very little independent political organization outside of the Cuban Communist Party in Cuba. All of those things are true. All of those things are problematic. I acknowledge all of that. Every government has its problems. Everybody in this call understands the problems we have here in the United States with our own government. So again, what I bristle at is this insistence that Cuba has to be perfect.
Right, but
That
just to just to
yeah,
go a
yeah,
little
yeah.
further to the point, what
So,
would be more examples of what you see at,
so a big
as
example is in 2019, they again as part of this like effort to this is a new Cuba now. They redid their constitution. They rewrote their constitution. And when we visited the capital of Cuba, the capital like building of Cuba, which is not in the independent piece, but is in the other writing that I did, we it was pretty cool because we went inside their capital. We like sat in the seats that the parliamentarians like sit at. Cuba has a unicameral government. So there's no House and Senate, it's just one body. It's made up of 600 people, and it's called the People's Assembly of State, the damn, the State Assembly of People's Power, or something like that. Some very cool name. And it's made up of 600 people, and these 600 people are basically elected at the municipal level, and they meet twice a year in the capital of Cuba, as one body, and then there are sub bodies of this 600 member body that meet throughout the year in different sessions to accomplish different things. A few interesting things about this body: by law, only 50% of the people who make up this body can be like politicians. So that means 50%, at least 50% of this body are just like teachers and people in the medical field and bus drivers and just random members of the community that get nominated through the Cuban Communist Party, right? Like it's all filtered through the Cuban Communist Party. And importantly, I think like a telling like caveat here is no candidate for the National Assembly has ever lost. So, you know, take that without, but it's a 600 member body. So they all meet. And so when we went to the Capitol, we met with an official there, and he described the process of Cuba's 2019 constitution. And the way I sort of envisioned it, the way is like the entire country was editing a Google Doc together at the same time, because what would happen is the National Assembly would meet, or like a committee of the National Assembly that was in charge of rewriting of like writing the Constitution would meet. They would put out a draft of a certain section of the Constitution, And then in each municipality, there were these local debate bodies that would debate that section and send, the results of whether they agree with it, things they want to change, back to the National Assembly, and the National Assembly would work on it, and they would go back and forth and back and forth. And it was this 3-month process of doing this as part of rewriting their constitution. So, you know, to me, that doesn't sound like an ironclad dictatorship to me. Um, does that sound like democracy in the same? Oh, and then in the end, it was all approved by referendum, right? There was a big island-wide, countrywide referendum that where they all, it passed overwhelmingly. There's some interesting tidbits. Like I found an article, I think in Reuters, about this one incident where the National Assembly wanted to take the this phrase like aspiring toward communism out of the Constitution. It was in there from the Soviet era Constitution, and these local debate bodies, like, it caused a big fit in the local debate bodies, and they sent feedback that they wanted it back in, and they went back and forth, and it actually the phrase ended up in the Constitution anyway. So, like, yes, there are imperfections. Duh, like that's how governments are, right? Like, for every fault I can find in Cuban democracy, I can find something similar in our democracy. Like, yes, like, there's a strong central state that sort of issues decrees, that issues proposals that are then, like, debated by the entire society. We don't decide things like that here. We don't decide things by referendum at a national level. Our voices are not heard in that way. We elect people, and those people kind of, like, do whatever they want, right? So it's just, I think what it
Right.
is a different conception of how to practice democracy. I think they have the advantage of being smaller. They have the advantage of, like, being geographically and, like, in terms of population being smaller, and they're able to do things in maybe a more, like, nimble way than we're able to do them here. But I don't find it I don't find the question of, like, is Cuba capital D democratic really that useful? Because what does capital D democratic mean? What standard are we holding them to? Are we holding them to the American system that is, like, pretty much hollowed out and bought out by, like, oligarchs? Is that what we're asking them to aspire to? No, I don't think we should ask them to aspire to that. Yeah, yes, there should be more independent or organization outside of the Communist Party in Cuba. That is 100% true. But it seems to me like what was definitely not true about Cuba is that there's this ironclad rule, and it's this, like, secretive hush hush, like, like, government that doesn't allow for debate or doesn't consult with people and imposes things on people. That is not what I saw. There's lots of debate. There's lots of referendums. There's just a lot of there's a political culture, period, in Cuba, which here it's all about, like, the culture wars. In Cuba, like, they actually talk about salient political things, including, like, their constitution is only a few years old. What about ours? Right? Like, can you imagine a process like that ever playing out in the United States in the same way? I can't. So, it's just it's a different way of conceiving of what democracy is and what a democracy can do. And so, yes, it has its flaws. That is 100% true, and they should do more to fix them. But one, like I said before, they all acknowledge that, including the president, starting with the president on down. Two, they're flying, what was the expression, putting the plane together while they're flying it, in a sense, right? Like, they're trying to build this socialist government and economy, like, without a guidebook and under, like, severe economic restrictions. So, I give them a little bit of leeway on that front.
Yeah, if I can just offer an observation, I mean, it seems like maybe a bottleneck they're up against in how they've structured themselves is by having this sort of singular party state, it provides us obviously a strong central government and ability to do various, take various initiatives. But it I wonder how much political activity or civic initiative can ever happen outside of that,
Yeah.
of that sort of the parameters the party sets, and independent social movement initiatives are kind of seen as inherently threatening. Of course, there's reasons to always wonder when the United States,
Yes. Right.
is funding and backing that sort of stuff. But by being in a situation where they have to kind of constantly see any independent initiative from outside of that exists outside of the government's favored initiatives, it seems to kind of create an impasse that that the society can only change
Yes.
so much,
That's
because
right.
anybody initiating change from outside of the parameters of what the government wants to talk about is seen as threatening.
Yeah. And
So
you know what
I don't
what
know how they
what what they
resolve
will
that.
tell you is most Cubans who have an issue go to the municipal office, and
Uh-huh.
that's where Cuban politics happen, right? At the local level, because they all know each other. There's a community. Blah, blah, blah. That's what
Yeah,
they
that's
say.
kind of like the Tip O'Neill version of all politics
Yes.
are local,
Yes. All
except
politics are local.
that only goes so
So,
far.
exactly. Do with that what you will. You
Yeah.
know, like I said, I am not here to pretend like it's some sort of like utopia, or that there's infinite political freedom in Cuba. That's just not true. We all know it's not true, but it's also not true here. So it's like, you guys should work on it. We should work on it. Everybody should work on it. Everybody should struggle toward a more democratic, more peaceful, and more, and but where they are ahead of us is, they have a society that has different assumptions around public resources, different assumptions about what people are entitled to, different assumptions about what it means to be a human being. So, like, that's it.
Yeah.
That's just where it is. And I'm not here to say it's perfect, because it's far from perfect. So
Yeah. And um speaking about existing under challenging economic circumstances, we'll put the donate link for our website back in the chat here.
yes. Yes. Can I just say, the
uh,
Independent is a treasure. I don't think people understand how much of a unique thing we have going here with the Independent. And I really want to encourage everyone here. If everyone here gives $5 today, that goes a long way toward helping them get. I think you guys are trying to raise what, 50K.
and
You're halfway there.
we were trying to reach 50. We've gotten to about 30 so far. So this is going to create some economic stress in the not too
Yes.
distant future for us in the coming months. I mean, we're doing more of these public events, including this stuff. We're doing two events at Star Bar this month. The March 7th one on Thursday, another one on the 23rd. But yeah, definitely people can give. I mean, if you can make a generous one-time contribution, if you want to sign up to become a monthly sustainer, 5, 10, $20 a month. When you go to independent.org/donate, when you see the prompts, that option is there too to become a monthly sustainer. We certainly really, I think like any organization, your monthly sustainers are sort of a bedrock that give you a certain amount of financial stability from one month to the next as those recurring donations come in. So that link is there in the chat. And we still have.
Yes. Please keep the indie going. It's such a vital resource for us here. And conversations like this, I think, are a great example of that.
Yeah, thank you. And so in our sort of remaining time here, of course, as we talked about at the beginning, you have this very close family connection to the whole story of the Cuban Revolution. Your grandfather was imprisoned for a number of years in the 1960s,
Yeah.
accused of counter-revolutionary activities. Um, maybe of somewhat dubious allegations there, or maybe the harshness of the response far exceeded
Yeah.
whatever he was up to. And then, of course, your uh, your grandmother and I think your mother all like as a child struggled tremendously before they ultimately fled to Cuba. I mean, fled to Miami. So you made this trek back to the old family house. You were the first person, I guess, from your family to find that that house where your family grew up in and lived for many years before the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Describe that a little bit. I mean, you described the trip beautifully in your article, so maybe people read that. But if you want to just elaborate on just what it was like to encounter this place that was so central to so many of the people you're closest to in this world and who've never been able to go back to it.
Yeah, I describe it in the piece of being as being a resting place of memory. And I think there's an argument to be made that it's probably the most important place in the world to my family. It's the house, at least to the mom side of my family, my grandma and my mom. It's the house where my grandmother was raised, and it's the house that my grandmother was raising my mother in also. And so it's very has a lot of sentimental. It's sort of like the source of all of their nostalgia about Cuba, and also the source of a lot of their anger about Cuba, right? Because it's like it represents this place that was, in their mind, sort of taken away from them or ruined, um, and yeah, it was very emotional. Um, there's this picture of my mom sitting at the steps of that house. She's like 5 years old. It's like a black and white photo um, of her and my great grandparents and my mom's cousins sitting on the steps of that house. Um, and yeah, just thinking like, had I had just a few historical lefts been historical rights, I would have been an important place for me too. And just to see this other, it's very rare that you get to see what another life might have been like for you, in the flesh, in the concrete, when it comes to the house. Yeah, and it was impactful for that reason. But the that was the sweet part of it. The bitter part of it was not being able to share the fact that I was there with my grandmother, not being able to share. I took dozens of pictures of it, not being able to share that with her because of the really intense emotions that she has around it. um so that there's pain there too, for me, definitely for her. And so I was able to lay that part of it to rest for me in going and sort of making this pilgrimage in a sense to see kind of where it all started. And yeah, there's a sense that like I said, there's this ghost of another life that was living there. And when back then in the 60s, when people fled, um, the government would take over the house, assign it to another family, and set the rent at 10% of the monthly wage of a worker, which I love that. I think that's fucking amazing. We should do that. But also it means that now like another family lives there. It's not my family's place anymore. Um, so again, I think the theme of the entire trip is like duality. Feeling this sense of like uh, returning to a place I had never been to, but felt like I had been to many times before. A place where the politics are, extremely like full of contradictions, where like idealism just crashes headfirst into like harsh economics, where someone can get IVF for ostensibly for free, but have trouble feeding those same children that they conceived, day over day. And that's just Cuba. That's what it is. It's a place that is like I say, hope and heartbreak kind of like mixed together in this very unique and potent way. I personally, I had not been so just like emotionally spent since I had my kid 8 years ago. That was the last time I remember feeling so just kind of like emotionally adrift. It's just like, like experiencing it, and it was a 5 day trip. Okay. All of this happened in the span of 5 days. It was incredibly intense. It was event after event after event. And then like capped off by this final visit to my grandma's house. It was very special. That part of it, and like it was like a half-hour taxi ride there, and talking to Luis, the taxi driver, and he would point out, "Oh, I'm sure your grandmother would get bread from this place," or, a lot of Cubans come here to listen to music, or, "Oh, this place is no longer the people who lived here moved away. The people who lived here moved away." There was a in the same, again, going back to this idea of like duality, there was this it's so hard to pin down, but there's like this pride and sadness on the part of Luis at the same time. And I think a lot of Cubans feel in a very similar way, where they're incredibly proud that they threw off the yoke of the most powerful empire the world has ever known, and they reclaimed their sovereignty, and they're forging their own path. But it's a very difficult path, and there's their choices have had consequences that I think are beyond even what they would have imagined, and they're trying to make do in this situation that is extremely difficult to navigate. And of course, like,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. Before we go here,
Mm-hmm.
there's one question that we didn't address yet that we can hit real quickly. Kathleen O'Reilly asks if there's anything more you can elaborate on about the education curriculum there, and maybe concisely, and and, and
That's
then
is
and then I
is
have
that a
one.
direct challenge?
And then I have one more question for you after that. That's sort of a little bit of a bigger picture final thought question.
Yeah. The curriculum, there is one curriculum that's set by the state, as far as I know. The I we didn't get into a lot of the nitty gritty. I do know that once you leave like your secondary school, you have a choice of going into sort of like to a trade school, or going to like a university. And so you're put at, like, you make a choice at the end of, let's say, high school, the equivalent of high school, and you're able to continue your education by going to a trade school, or like more of an academic track. And of course, like, all the education there is paid for by the government. There's no
Right.
private tuition or anything there. Yeah, but I don't know too much about the curriculum that those kids were doing. They were doing math when we were there, for what it's worth, and many of them were saying, "I can count to 10 in English," and they would count out loud, and we all would clap for them, and it was very sweet. Um, but yeah.
Right. And then last thought. So you organize here in New York with the Democratic Socialists of America. Um,
Yes.
so we've talked about kind of how Cuba sort of ended up where it is and under the pressures of capitalism and all the rest. Uh, do you see a path, like the path for change in the U.S.? I mean, obviously, an armed revolution is not going to happen here. If anybody's going to do it, it's going to be like the far right wing
Yeah.
Christian gun nuts. Um,
Yes.
so in terms of a path to systemic change, uh, given the limitations that we currently face with our own government, I don't know any
Yeah. Yeah.
as an
Um,
act here in in New York and USA as an activist. Any last thoughts on that, and trying to build toward a socialist future, or
yeah.
some sort of better future than what we have now?
Yeah. You know, geez. First, I don't think there's one path. I think there are lots of paths that many different people can and should be walking. My particular, I always say, actually, like kind of ironically, that I don't want to live through a revolution. Um, I maybe now I've just had this like, you should be a therapist, John, because I just had this like epiphany that maybe it's because of my family history that I don't want to live through a revolution, because I understand what the consequences of that would be. And so I'm pulling out all the stops of trying to achieve change without having to do that. And I believe very fervently that we need to work on the outside and on the inside. We need to elect people through the mechanisms that we have, but also we need outside agitation and pressure continuously. And we
Labor
need,
organizing.
yes, I think labor, the like recent labor resurgence that we're seeing in the country is a huge cause for hope, and it's a really big deal. And I think we'll have repercussions for a long time, and it's only trending upward. I think, you know, it's grim. There's no question about it. But I always go back to, I think it's a Gramsci quote that it's like, the old world is dying, the new one struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And so that's where we are right now. The old world is very clearly being left behind and is flailing out violently, I think, in an effort to sort of hold on to as much as it can. But
For example.
yes, exactly. And there is the seed of a new world is there, and it just needs constant tending and cultivation. Um, and like, you know, that's, hope is a discipline. That's what I always go back to every day. You have to cultivate it. It's not going to come naturally from on high. You have to cultivate a discipline of political optimism and hope, because otherwise it will not, it's just not, look around. It's not going to come to you naturally. And so I think we're in a very hard political transition right now. And not to say it's going to go the right way. It could not go the right way very easily. And so we really have to, you know, like I say, pull out every possible stop that we can. And then the further backdrop is we're up against the climate clock here, which is sort of I think a different dimension that other movements in the past, you know, may not have dealt with in the same way. And so, but I believe that eco-socialism is the way through, involving labor, involving the entire economy in a transition away from fossil fuels, is the way that we're going to get through this crisis, because it's going to require collective action at a scale that really we haven't seen in the US anyway since the New Deal. That's why it's called the Green New Deal, because we need that same level of and more mobilization. And hopefully, if we do it right, we can have a more socialist way of organizing the economy, where there's a lot more sharing and a lot less hoarding. And that's my pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll leave it there. Danny Valdes.
Oh yeah, I will put my email here in the chat. If anybody wants to reach out, I would, you know, happy to continue conversations with folks. And my Twitter handle, I'm also going to put that in here.
Yes.
And folks can follow me on Twitter. Yeah, and thank you so much, John. And really, if you have not given to the Indy, please consider doing so. It's such a great publication, and we're still, look at all those beautiful print newspapers. Come on.
I'm here at the Independent office, aka the Indy World headquarters. Yeah.
And if you ever have any question about any issue of the Independent, ask John. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of every issue the Independent has ever put out.
Your last cover article was issue 136. Pages
136. And what was this issue that just came out with the Cuba
285.
285. Wow. Okay. So it has been a while. It has been a while.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for hearing me out. I appreciate it. I know there was I noted I saw the disagreement, and it's all noted. And I'm glad that we're able to have a discussion like the one that we're able to have.